earthquake near the Statue of Liberty.
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. JJ, what are you doing to me? You release a relatively decent monster flick in 2008, then follow that up 8 years later by announcing a completely unexpected sequel and release it a month later, and it turns out to be fucking great? This time I kind of knew about this movie, or at least the idea of it, and JJ just decides, fuck it, let's officially announce it and release it within a few hours. I can only think that Cloverfield 4 is just going to be JJ actually fucking creating a monster and unleashing it on New York for the bants. Either that or everyone will get a brick through their window with the Blu-ray attached to it. Cloverfield 4 is in development, by the way. It's meant to be some kind of World War II movie where the Nazis are doing some naughty experiments and accidentally create something they shouldn't. But this review isn't about that. It's about the Cloverfield Paradox, also called Cloverfield Station or God Particle at various stages of its development. Has JJ and director Julius Onah 1-up-10 Cloverfield Lane, which was my favourite film of 2016? Well, to answer that, I'll be delving deep into spoiler territory, so watch the movie on Netflix if you don't want it spoiled. However, if you've come to this video to watch me ramble about how this movie is more disappointing than Ivanka Trump's sex life, then buckle up, son. It's going to be a rough ride. So I'll start with the characters. None of them are particularly gripping. I mean, you gravitate towards Ava a little, but that's only because she's the first person you see. It's the cinematic equivalent of a baby making an impression on its mother. There's not one character in this movie who I like. I mean, Chris O'Dowd is a little funny in it, but he's basically just Roy from the IT crowd again, but he just seems way out of place in this movie. David Oyelowo, nailed it, as Keel is a generic spaceship captain with little more to him than that. Daniel Bruhl gives a decent performance as Schmidt, but he's a bit like his character in Captain America Civil War. A bit mysterious, but nothing more than that. John Ortiz as Monk Acosta says approximately 3 lines of dialogue in the whole movie. Axel Henny as Volkov is generic aggressive Russian guy. Typical of an American movie to make the Russian guy the arsehole, isn't it? Zhang Zi as Tam had potential to be interesting, as she is the only one on the ship that isn't there in the other dimension, but the movie takes that idea nowhere, so she's just another crew member who may or may not have been shagging Daniel Bruhl's character. Elizabeth Debicki as fake Brienne of Tarth is the only character in the movie with any real intrigue. You suspect she's a bad one because, well, just look at her face through the entirety of the film. If this face doesn't scream ulterior motive, then I don't know what does. She still has that little bit of mystery, but it turns out that she's exactly what you expected her to be. Finally, we have Roger Davies as Michael, who is the most wooden actor I've ever seen in a Hollywood movie. I've seen actors in The Room do a better job. May as well call this dude Geppetto, he's so fucking wooden. I don't know if he just didn't care about the part, he was directed to act this way, or he just completely lacks any talent, but his delivery of his lines and his reactions to things are noticeably terrible. It's like he's doing a screen test for lighting or something, so he's just going through the motions while the lighting crew get things set up. Clover Nee as Molly would have been a good character, but her and Michael's story is never really explored. In fact, it doesn't need to be in the movie at all, but I'll get to that later. The movie opens up with some of the worst exposition you'll ever see. We start with a news report that tells us the world's resources will be fully exhausted within 5 years. Then we're told that if the astronauts get the particle accelerator working, it will produce free energy in the world forever, solving the energy crisis. I'm not abridging here, by the way. Those are the exact words spoken. Then we get a scene in a car which is probably one of the worst scenes in cinematic history. It's completely unnecessary. Anything that's said in this scene can be deciphered by the audience naturally within the first few minutes of the following scene. The highlight of bad dialogue in this scene is this.
Forget about me and what I want, which is for you to stay. Why do you think?
Because you're sweet. Because people are starving. Because our energy supplies are running out. And this mission could unlock an endless supply of power that could save us all.
I fucking know that. I just got that information from the news article not 30 seconds before this scene takes place. There's awful exposition the whole way through this movie, but this opening scene just takes the piss. Not a good start, JJ and Julius. Not a good start. I'm fully aware that this movie wasn't a Cloverfield movie when it was originally written and has been adapted to be so long into production once JJ got his paws in it. But I have to say, they didn't really do a good job making it feel like a Cloverfield film. 10 Cloverfield Lane was completely different from the original movie, but it had that underlying heavy tone of threat and peril. It also had a monster in the form of John Goodman himself, and the whole is there or is there not aliens or a plague happening above the bunker idea. It was shrouded in mystery with 3 great characters and a potentially huge threat lurking just above them. The Cloverfield Paradox has nothing like this. It's got boring characters and the only real threat to them is some weird science shit happening because they jump dimensions. There's a bit of mystery at first, but ultimately there's none of that really heavy tone or threat of peril that the other 2 movies have. I can get away with movies being part of the Cloverfield anthology if they are at least connected thematically, and I guess overall this movie is, but just barely. It needs much more. In fact, I'd say this movie needs at least 4 more redrafts in order for it to be a good movie. There is some good ideas in it actually. Having 2 people from different dimensions on the same ship while one group is trying to get back is an interesting conflict to have. Watching Ava see a happier version of herself that exists in this universe where her 2 children are still alive is an interesting setup to see how a person could change under that realization, and I liked how they showed Volkov and Schmidt go toe to toe because their nations back home were on the brink of war. It's an interesting idea to show how a multicultural space station would react if their home countries below were at each other's throats. But none of these ideas are handled particularly well, which is why I think it needs a few more redrafts. Not only to clean up the terrible dialogue, but to just work those ideas into the plot a little more. At the moment, this movie is like bread dough. It has the potential to be a great loaf of bread, but those ideas need to be kneaded into the dough and then cooked in order to get the full flavour. I've resorted to using baking analogies in my videos, guys. It's all downhill from here. But yeah, there's a good story here, but there's just too much sci-fi channel-esque pieces of dialogue and plot beats. One of the biggest examples of this is the scene with Donald Logue explaining his book called The Cloverfield Paradox, title drop, where he tells the news anchor interviewing him that this particle accelerator has the potential to smash dimensions together and unleash monsters and demons. And guess what happens when they turn on the particle accelerator? That's right, they travel a dimension where Harvey Weinstein isn't a horrendous sex offender. Actually, that's not true. I imagine he's a fucking maggot in every conceivable dimension, but you get my point. Donald's scene in this is far too literal and it just removes all of the mystery from the movie. If they're going to go ahead with saying everything in this movie can happen because the particle accelerator defies the laws of physics, then they can get away with not directly explaining how it can transport our crew across dimensions and unleash a monster on the world. The guys on the ship can work out for themselves in a more natural way that they're in an alternate dimension and the audience can go along with that just fine. As for the demons and monsters part of his story, it's a fucking Cloverfield film. Of course there's going to be a monster or demon. There is actually a way they could have made this film way better, even keeping most of the original jigsaw in place, just changing a few things up. So I guess I'll pitch it. Okay, so I really haven't thought about this too much, but I'd basically keep most of this movie the same, for now. There's a lot needs changing to make it perfect, but we'll just run with all of the shit for now. Completely remove Jensen and just make Ava her character. Our crew discover they're in a different dimension, and earlier in the movie, maybe at the very start, we see Ava's tragic backstory where her power cell ended up killing her children. So when our astronauts discover they're in a new dimension, Ava discovers there's an alternative version of herself on this new Earth where her kids are alive, and that their Cloverfield station crashed into the sea. So their planet has no chance of solving the energy crisis like we see in the movie. I'm not sure how she'd find this out without Jensen, but let's say that some kind of hard drive appears on the ship or something like that. I'm aware that's not great, but I've given this about 10 minutes of thought or so. Anyway, Ava then becomes the monster on the ship and starts manipulating the crew to try and get them to take her to this new Earth. Eventually the crew resists or something like that, so she resorts to more shooty gun means like Jensen does at the end of this movie. However, unlike Jensen, Ava is successful and she takes over the ship to save her children below. So, the villain wins to save the one she loves. Kind of like a how far would you go to save your children idea. You could argue that in this version of the movie, love is actually the monster, as it has corrupted her enough to turn on her entire crew and damn her own dimension's population to certain death, in order to save 2 important people to her, which is an interesting concept. Anyway, she tries to call for help on Earth but gets no response. She can't stay on the ship, so she jettisons herself down to the new planet, and as she gets out of the escape pod, she is greeted by the Cloverfield monster, absolutely smashing New York or some other city to pieces. It turns out that when they travel dimensions, that unleashed the Cloverfield monster on the planet. That way, she's a villain for taking over the space station to save her own children, but it turns out that they're a lost cause anyway, and she gets her comeuppance for being selfish by being utterly fucked up by an even bigger villain. Kind of like a predator in the food chain being killed off by an apex predator. So that's my pitch for how to improve this movie with 10 minutes of thought. I'm aware it's not perfect, but I think it's better than what we got. Even if they just changed the ending, it would be a little better. It suffered from the same problem as 10 Cloverfield Lane, it didn't reveal the monster properly. Cloverfield Lane should have just had Mary Elizabeth Winstead climb out of the bunker and be met with a UFO destroying something. Similarly, Ava and Schmidt should have climbed out of this capsule all smiling and happy faces, and then wham! Decent band, the Cloverfield monster shows up and obliterates a city. End. The way they did it in the movie was questionable at best. It was about as sudden as a fist up your arse. Come on, JJ, make the Cloverfield additions to these movies with at least a little bit of quality. Come to think of it, there's an entire plotline in this movie that just doesn't need to be there whatsoever. I get that having Michael back on Earth is Ava's connection, so we kind of need him in the movie to send her messages or see him react to the fact that the station has vanished or whatever, but his whole plotline with the kid is completely unnecessary. You could very easily cut him entirely from the movie and not lose too much, but the kid especially. She serves no purpose that I can think of. Unless they made a movie about him and her in that bunker and vibing off of 10 Cloverfield Lane, there's no reason to introduce her to him. He can go to that bunker himself and still serve the same purpose. Since she offers no purpose, I see no point in her. Maybe they were planning on having he and Ava adopt her as their child at the end of the original movie before it got turned to Cloverfield. Who knows? Just thought it was worth mentioning this plotline is entirely not needed. There's thousands of movies out there that set up certain rules and scenarios that allows them to get away with weird shit happening. Harry Potter explains everything with magic, Star Wars gets around a few plot holes with the Force, and even Back to the Future uses its own rules of time travel in order to explain some bullshit that happens. As for the Cloverfield Paradox, it uses particle instability as the result of two dimensions smashing together. Now I don't know if this is genius writing or the laziest writing ever. It's lazy because it makes sure the writers don't have to really explain anything they don't feel like explaining, and it's genius because it allows the writers to put literally anything in this movie and not need to explain it. However, this is definitely to their detriment, since some of it comes off as downright stupid. The idea that the gyro and the worms somehow ended up inside Volkov and he's kind of being manipulated by the worms. What? The worst part of this movie though is the whole section with Chris O'Dowd's arm getting sucked through a wall into the ship to their home dimension. Chris O'Dowd then just comically asks where his arm is and if it'll grow back and such, complete with some sci-fi channel levels of CGI on his arm. It looks like a joint of meat from a fucking cartoon. This collection of scenes was more out of place than a KKK member at a basketball game. None of it fit tonally with the movie, and then they go and make Chris O'Dowd's disembodied arm sentient and able to write some exposition on the ground to advance the plot. We then see his arm kept in a cage throughout the movie in the background like it's some reject from Borgin and Burks. See, disembodied sentient arms work in Harry Potter because it's aimed at kids to young adults and has a fairly light-hearted tone, at least in the early movies. But the Cloverfield Paradox is very serious and unfunny, and this thinking, writing, disembodied Irish arm is just some of the weirdest shit I've ever seen. Surely JJ must have seen this bit of the script and thought, yeah guys, I'm a pass on this one. Or at least ask them to change it. Even this season of The Walking Dead doesn't have writing this bad, and ho does that have terrible writing. As for the technical aspects, the opening 15 minutes or so of this movie are all over the place in terms of editing and pacing. The whole movie feels a little bit disjointed, but that's mostly due to the script. However, the intro just feels disconnected because of the sequencing and editing of it. Nothing really connects together or flows very well. It doesn't help that we can completely lose the scene in the car and still have the same movie, but hey, there it is, unnecessarily extending the runtime and making the intro more clunky. The rest of the editing in this movie is fine, but the opening minutes really are a bumpy ride. There is some very good visual effects in this movie and fairly high production values in terms of set design and costume design. Everything looks good, but it still can't shake that TV movie feel that it has from the very first shot. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's just something in this movie's visuals that makes it look like a low-budget sci-fi movie from Sci-Fi than a fully fledged Hollywood blockbuster. But it's not the effects because they're very good. It's not the set design or costumes either. The cinematography and lighting isn't noticeably awful either. I just don't understand what it is that makes it look subpar. Ironically, this movie had the biggest budget of the 3 Cloverfield movies and it looks, and undoubtedly is, the weakest. Cloverfield had a budget of 25 million, 10 Cloverfield Lane had 15 million, and the Cloverfield Paradox had a whopping 45 million, almost double that of the first movie and more than the other two put together. Sure, it has more visual effects, but the overall quality of this movie is far worse. The acting is subpar and the writing and direction are poor. The alarm bells did start ringing when I found out that it was just dropped on Netflix with barely any marketing whatsoever, but I felt after the surprise of how good 10 Cloverfield Lane was, there was still hope. How wrong I was. Overall, the Cloverfield Paradox is a Hollywood movie that reeks of B-movie quality. The acting is poor, the writing is even worse, there's horrible expositional dialogue and scenes and plot lines that just come completely out the blue or end up going nowhere. The Cloverfield connection is so ham-fisted and poorly executed, it's easy to see that this movie was not part of the franchise but got taken over at the last second. There is some interesting ideas and the film is genuinely entertaining at points, and there is at least a little mystery to it in some parts. It's also not bad to look at, even if it does have that TV movie feel throughout. So it's not all bad, there's definitely a few things to like here. But the fact of the matter is that the writing and plot is so bad that it's a wonder this movie even got greenlit. It's basically The Room if it had a really big budget with a huge crew and talented visual effects guys. Only without the charm. It's disappointing that this movie is bad because after 10 Cloverfield Lane I was really excited at the kind of stuff they could do with this franchise based around the very loose connection to Cloverfield. When I heard this movie was about a space station it seemed very promising, and they kept it very hidden, which was either a big plus or a massive red flag. Turns out in this case it was a bigger red flag than a boyfriend who angrily asks where you've been when you've just had to take a massive shit. Still, I look forward to the World War II Cloverfield movie. They can't all be bad, right? If we get another 10 Cloverfield Lane, I'll be a happy bunny. The Cloverfield Paradox gets 2.5 frames out of 5. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Film Rant.